what I'd like to do in transition here, because it feels like we're in transition, why don't we just chat amongst ourselves for a few minutes, and then we can invite our audience. No, seriously, what I'd like to begin with is a bit of chronology as we're looking at the agency model and the efficacy of that model and the agency-client relationships as we go forward. And what I'd like to do, and Alicia, I apologize to you because you've heard this before, but I'd like to bring a bit of chronology, particularly here in Paris, as it relates to the year 2018 and the year 1859. Now, I know I'm old, but I'm not that old. But the year 1859 rings true to me in 2018. In the year 1859, Charles Dickens wrote a book called The Tale of Two Cities, and he began with a famous line, the best of times, the worst of times. I think you could apply that to 2018 as we look across the landscape of our ecosystem. What also happened in 1859 was another Charles Darwin, wrote on the origin of the species. And I think if you take a page from the origin of the species, we talk about the survival of the fittest. And only those who can adapt survive. So if I were to set a table for this conversation, I think the year 1859 points us in the right direction. So here we are in 2018 at VivaTech, and hats off to VivaTech to assemble this sort of a group in Paris in late May. Quite extraordinary. But as we look at our landscape and as we look at the agency-client relationship, what I'd love to do, Clive, is start with you. You've spent a good deal of your career, obviously, on the client side, and you've seen so much transition. If you look at today in the relationship with your agency partners, and just look back to when you started in the industry, not in 1859, of course, but when you close, but when you started in the industry, could you point to two or three things easily that are different in that relationship today versus when you began?
Yeah, I'd say probably two profound and fundamental differences. One, when I started, I was 89, and I watched the relationships between agencies and clients. It was first and foremost a commercial relationship. In other words, the depth of the relationship was predicated on the agency contributing to the commercial success of their client. And creativity was a means to drive commercial success. And maybe later we can talk about that. And then, obviously, it was much less complex. There were much less moving parts. And that made for a much simpler relationship and, frankly, a much more profitable relationship for the agency. The margins, I can say, without a doubt, were significantly greater. And that had a profound effect on their ability to deliver value. But I'd say those are the two biggest differences relative to now. I find the relationships less commercially oriented. The clients tend to not, and I'm painting a very broad brush, but I think the clients don't necessarily look at the agencies as major drivers of commercial outcome.
And let me take that a step further, because you said something at the beginning that I found interesting. You said something, and I'm going to paraphrase, that sounded transactional, not strategic.
To the contrary, in the past, when I first started, the relationships are very strategic, and now it's become more transactional.
And from a client perspective,
yes.
Have your KPIs changed? Are you satisfied? Again, I'm not asking if you're satisfied with your agency. I'm asking you this in a broad sense. Are you satisfied with the transactional nature, or do you think there's, and I say this tongue in cheek, is there money left on the table? Is there opportunity left on the table?
Yeah, well, I'm in a constant state of dissatisfaction, but I think the KPIs haven't changed. At the end of the day, we have to drive growth both in the top and the bottom, and we have to drive margin expansion, and we have to invest in the future. You can't cut your way to prosperity. I hate to say there's money left on the table because, quite frankly, I think clients and agencies have conspired to take out all the value in the industry, and I think that's incredibly destructive. I think there's value on the table, and it's rapidly being eroded because of this race to zero. And I'm happy to talk at length about that, but I want to give my colleagues a chance. But we have conspired with agencies to rip out the value in the industry, and it's an absolute tragedy. And we're doing it together. We're equally accountable.
So I want to throw this up as a jump ball to either Peter or Brandon in terms of the role of the publisher today, the role of the platform, in terms of the creation of content.
So yeah, I'll jump in. When we look at our business, we have a newsroom. We actually have multiple newsrooms creating hundreds of pieces of content per day across a number of formats that are engaging an audience that we can sell advertising against. That is our first business. But the other function of that newsroom and that content is it throws off a lot of data that we can then use to help marketers tell their stories in a way that leverages what we've learned doing those hundreds of pieces of content every day. So we're not talking necessarily about targeting data, we're talking about how to tell a story and how that story should be different on Facebook than it might be for our site, than it might be for their own websites. It's talking about data around topics and how to plan those topics and those kinds of things. So we see that as a primary role for our best customers, the customers who really want to lean in and do a lot of work with us. What is often the case, though, is they don't actually, marketers don't always come to publishers looking for us to create content with them. They look for us to kind of put our stamp on the thing they want to say. And so our best partners are really working with us to leverage our best practices. And the rest of this is really just a different form of advertising.
So, Brandon, I would ask you the same thing. As being part of Turner and as part of a larger organization that's in the business of creating content, is there disintermediation today from the client agency? Again, we're looking at the agency configuration. Is there a disintermediation that's going on in content creation? Again, just looking back for a moment, everybody would agree, I think, that several years ago, if the dreaded D word, disintermediation, was being used, it was being used against the backdrop of media, not against creative. And yet today, clients, marketers, etc., are seeking creativity from wherever they can get it, from the publisher. They're creating in-house content. They're focused on it in a different way. You're not just then selling spots, you're selling content.
I mean, I think the relationship with the consumer's changed, right? And I think the publishers have that relationship with the consumer. I think social had a big push in that. You know, when you have that direct conversation with your consumers, you want to create content that speaks to them in a certain way. So the creative agencies, in a sense, have kind of lost that part in a particular way where we're creating content. Our studio internally called Create has been creating content for brands. We have a brand like Great Big Story that pushes that content across all the social handles across Turner. To be able to do that is unique and different and not something that you're willing to hand the keys over for someone else to do. So it's not only just the content creation, but the distribution and that connection with the audience has really changed the game, I think, in that space. So,
Alicia, I was chatting with Mark Pritchard earlier during one of the previous panels, and I had a conversation with Tony Rogers yesterday about the role of a CMO today. And the role of a CMO today is different. We've watched a morphing of that role. We've watched this go from somebody who was focused only on marketing, all of a sudden having a new friend in the C-suite, and that's the chief technology or the chief information officer. So the role has changed, right? I mean, today a CMO has to make as many tech decisions as they do marketing decisions, and a chief technology officer has to make as many marketing decisions, or certainly more than they've ever made before. From the perspective of Deloitte, and from your vantage point, one of the advantages that people say management consulting firms who have now become marketing organizations as well have is your access to the C-suite. We hear that all the time. So with that privileged access to the C-suite, do you find that difference between, or that similarity now, kind of that new mix, that morphed? If this was weird science, you wouldn't make Kelly LeBrock, you could make a CIO CMO, or you could do something totally different.
So it's true that is it working now? The modern CMO is now expected to be a growth driver. The role has completely changed within the C-suite and is actually more strategic than ever. It's a much more interesting role than ever, a more powerful role than ever, potentially, if that CMO can speak the language of business, is fluent in technology, and understands how to use the data to their advantage. Getting that equation right is a whole new game for CMOs and requires not only partnership across the C-suite, but approaching capabilities in an entirely new way. But when they can do that, as Clive mentioned, getting to top line growth as well as bottom line is a power spot for the CMO in a world where customer-centric companies are winning.
So Clive, in that role as a CMO, how has your perspective changed in that regard? Do you know the CIO better than you used to?
Yeah, I think historically, to your point, the CMO's role was what I would say small M marketing. I got to make a campaign, I got to work with the agencies. The CMO now is accountable for driving and being part of the team that drives growth. And to your point, that starts with a significant technology background. Our CMO, Gail's sitting over there. If you have a conversation with her, you'd think you're talking with our CIO. And so I think that's radically changed. But I think that the other thing is the CMO historically was probably the biggest KPI was equity score. For us, the CMO score is growth. One of the consequences of healthy growth is we will build equity, but that's an outcome, it's a consequence, it's not the KPI.
So as we look at, going back again to that survival of the fittest and the agility, I listened to the GDPR panel that Lisa Donahue was moderating a bit ago, and what she was talking about, or one of the panelists was talking about, the smaller companies have an advantage in compliance with GDPR because a startup doesn't have the legacy around there, what I characterize as the yoke of legacy infrastructure or the yoke of legacy policy around their neck. CNN has been around now for a very long time. I'm old enough to remember when it started, but it has been around for a very long time. And I'm somebody who says I hope it's around for a very, very, very long time. Thank you. But from that perspective, do you think that's true or not true? That, and again, I'm not talking about the GDPR of it all. I'm talking about the legacy infrastructure, because you've done business a certain way for a very long time. And are you able to be agile? Are you able to pivot to what the new CMO, the new client, the new marketer is looking for?
Well, GDPR is also a resource issue. And I think for leaner startups to have a chief data officer and policies in place and to make sure this is being managed is going to be difficult. It's also a consumer issue. It's people who have direct relationships with consumers. So if you're a tech startup, you rely on other people for your relationship. So having that relationship and having that understanding of what you do with your data and how you protect it and how you control it is going to be much easier for publishers, maybe not large and small. I don't think the size is going to make much difference. I think really it's going to, when you start going down the line of third-party tech and different layers that don't have that relationship, I think it's going to be really difficult for them, regardless of how agile and flexible their new systems are. If they're relying on other people to handle their consent and their protection, it's going to be a challenge.
So Alicia, I know Mark is to my left, but Mark lit a match several months ago, and we were chatting about this. I don't think he started the fire, but he lit a match. I hope he's smiling. But he lit a match when he talked about the mashup of agencies and bringing disparate agencies together to create the best in class for what the marketer needs. Holding companies aside, affiliations aside, just give me the best that you've got and we'll create that model. Does that work from your perspective? I mean, we all understand strange bedfellows get created that way because competitors, get together. It's in the spirit of our industry today.
Well, it's all about driving inefficiency out of the system, whether it's in media, in the agency sort of process. The agency model was built for a world that moved much more slowly than today's world. And to get to value, as Clive was mentioning, driving into how do you actually rebuild workflows that allow you to take advantage of that data and technology is the name of the game when we look at the new model across the ecosystem of partners as well as in-house resources. And I think the focus there is on getting to value. How do you get to those best ideas and most quickly? Because that's the name of the game, and it makes complete sense to me. We've built out an open talent model called DELOITTE Pixel that allows you to break down all of those workflows so you can dive in at those moments where you actually need value. It's a completely new way to approach work.
And the client should have the luxury of choosing, a sort of menu. I guess these days you can't call it by any ethnic group, so a menu of various choices.
Absolutely.
I want to turn to Peter and Brandon again and talk about news in the context of framing a day. So 12 years ago, I had a conversation with Malcolm Gladwell, and I said to him, if you were going to date down the tipping point, at that time it was to 2006, so it was years after he'd written the book. I said, would you add a chapter? And he said he would add a chapter on framing. And I said, I presume you don't mean picture framing? And he said, no. He said, for him, for Malcolm Gladwell, the front page of the New York Times framed his day as he was growing up. He looked at that, it told him what he needed to focus on and what was important. So it did create that frame. This was at a time when we didn't have the ability as consumers to really create our own frame. From a news perspective, models aside, from a news perspective, do you still think that's part of your job, to frame the consumer's day, at least around the news cycle that you cover in either case?
I mean, social is really framing a lot of, there's a lot more involved in people's day, right? So news serves its purpose, and people come to get information. The choice that they have is ridiculous. I mean, you can get your news from a lot of sources. So, but the framing now comes from your peer group, your social groups, and multiple sources. So, in a sense, we're almost customizing our own frame on a day-to-day basis. Our job is still to make sure that the news and the right news gets to the people, and that we, hold people accountable to the truth. And as long as they can feel like they've got that from us, then we've done our job.
I agree with that completely. I think the thing I'd also add is we very frequently see an audience start at an article rather than a homepage. So what we've been working on significantly, and we're certainly not alone in this, is how do you then add the frame after they've come in for a particular article? How do you add this is what we think is important right now, even if you came in for a very specific piece of information, be it from search or social or a newsletter or a friend texting you something. So we actually are having to support kind of both use cases, the person who's coming for a very specific piece of information and the person who's coming quickly to scan the headlines, what happened since I last checked the news. And we do see really every hour and then also on the half hour, which I interpret to be when people are going between meetings, we will see a spike in traffic where people will quickly check the homepage. That is a function that is actually increasing. And we're seeing homepage traffic now growing considerably. I think partially just because there's so much news that all the time it seems, and the metabolism for this information is growing. But then we're also having people we see once that we'll never see that person again, or we'll only see that person once every 3 months, and they're coming for something very specific that we may have written 3 years ago, and we want that use case to also be excellent.
So let me switch back to our topic at hand. I digress. In conversations with marketers today, and I come from an agency background, so this was not exactly music to my ears when I started to hear it, if I put my former hat on. With my current hat on, it's all good. But clients begin sentences these days more and more with, "Don't tell my agency, but," fill in the blank. Now, they don't literally mean that, but that really goes to the heart of the issue around insourcing and in bringing things in-house. Is that a temporary affectation, or is that the road we're on?
I'm happy. I think that that's symptomatic of a much greater and underlying root cause problem. And there's a question over there about talent train, but I'll go back to my first comment. The noise you hear is clients are cutting agencies' fees, clients are pitching agency business, fees are coming down, clients are unhappy, and clients are looking at other solutions like insourcing. And I think we run the risk of playing to the symptom and not getting to the root cause. The root cause is clients are not seeing the value. When you're having a pricing conversation, it's a value conversation, it's not a pricing conversation. If you respond to pricing, what's going to happen is you're going to keep driving down the price. And that's a predictable outcome. And what I believe is happening is two things. One, agencies are chasing revenue, not margin. And clients are killing agencies' margin. And when you chase revenue, not margin, you got to recover. And the only way you recover, because your biggest cost is people, frankly, your only cost is people, you start killing the talent. And when you kill the talent, you kill the value, and then you go into the cycle of price. And I think that we have to have a conversation, clients and agencies, to address that and fix that. And you know, I've heard people say, well, clients are tight, clients are cheap. You just got to look what we spend with consultants. We spend plenty.
Value.
Well, no,
Value.
in seriousness, because we see value. Probably we've spent a little too much, just to be sure. But there's value. We see value.
But the night is young, Clive.
Precisely. But so I would be asking the question, why don't we see the value, and why are we conspiring to drive the value out? Because if you look at the historical model of the agencies, it was the most innovative, the most creative, not crafting, creative, as in ideas, driver of commercial outcome.
But is that then, and Alicia, this is a layup for you, potentially. Is that one of the advantages that the consultancies have as you reimagine your business? Because I go back to legacy, one of the challenges in our industry, and this is true in any kinds of relationships, is the breakdown of trust. And let's just put it out there. The breakdown of trust is real. Do the management consulting firms that are now really full service marketing agencies in the same way as any holding company, do you have an advantage because A, you've got that auditing relationship on the one side, maybe a different side of the house, but you've got that trust. Does that trust transferring, and is that an advantage for you because you're not part of what was, you're part of what can be? And I don't know if I articulated the question right, but I think you understand where I'm going.
I actually think the advantage is deeper than that. I think we've been around for 173 years.
You look great.
We've seen 1859, right? The amount of change that we've seen is tremendous, and that we've adapted to. We love change. We're looking for it all the time. We embrace it. We're not committed to one model, and that orientation towards change is a huge advantage for us now, because what we're doing is about what the clients need. It's about the way the needs of brands have changed. It's around, and responding to that. And I think that makes a tremendous difference in the way that we're delivering capabilities and supporting the in-house effort and what clients actually need to win now.
And is that easier from a consultative perspective? I mean, we talked earlier about strategic versus tactical, but consulting tends to be on the side of strategic. I mean, if I have to do word association, I would associate strategic with consulting, not a tactical approach.
Well, the difference is we're looking at the whole game board, right? We're working across the business. We're actually about operating the business, and marketing's role in it is huge if approached strategically. So that's the advantage.
So from a publisher perspective, Peter, Brandon, going back to the don't tell my agency but, how do you navigate? I mean, it's you know, a bridge over troubled water in a sense, because you have to do, and not have to, you need to do business with the agencies, and yet if the clients want that direct interaction, you're not in the business of turning it away. How do you navigate that?
Well, first off, when I hear some sentiment like, don't tell my agency but, what I'm really hearing is that there's a desire to integrate elements that the agency may not touch. So I think one of the fundamental challenges right now is the advertising business has been built around standard units, 30-second commercials, page ads, whatever it might be. And increasingly, we're talking about targeting content of some sort, maybe an ad, with customer data or contextual data or other kinds of things that are touching pieces of the business and maybe are using units that are no longer standard. So we view our role in the publisher as, first of all, we share a client with the agency. That CMO, that senior marketer, is our shared client, and we let them tell us how to work, but we're often the integrator on large programs where programmatic and content need to work together. We can help process that, but we can certainly not do that alone, and the agency has a huge part to play in that, but we're looking at the senior marketer to tell us how to work with these different portions. We're also talking now to PR agencies and crisis communication groups.
So
and all sorts of
you've
other
become
things.
a systems integrator.
In
you
a
should
sense,
talk
yeah.
to Alicia. You guys could get something going here.
So we can't certainly do that with every client, but there are clients who are looking to us for that help, and that's where our most meaningful advertising relationships will come.
So one of the questions I saw from the audience is about the brain drain. And I was fortunate to be at the unpacking of Marcel yesterday as Artur Sadoun spoke about this being around people and the need to touch the 80,000 people inside of Publicis. And I was very respectful of that, because what he talked about was how that will help diversity. And not diversity in the way we talk about it every day, just diversity of idea, diversity of approach, diversity, which is such an important concept. And you know, technology enables that. And what we talked about is, even in the hiring practice, diversity, I don't think, comes from saying we must hire a woman for this or we must hire somebody of ethnic diversity. That doesn't work either. What works is creating, I think, a diverse panel, a diverse slate. And what I said to Artur was, what you've done is you haven't ensured diversity, but you've ensured a diverse slate, because you're going to be receiving the inputs from so many different places. Do you think something like that will actually help in maintaining the people? Because if there is a brain drain, we don't want to lose the best people, you know, to another industry.
I mean, I think what Publicis have done with Marcel and their intention is fantastic. And I think it has the potential to be transformative. But it's only one piece of the equation. So it's a platform, and it's done right, will be an incredibly liberating platform to get diversity of thinking and to create a much more open forum for ideas to travel faster and to reduce friction from the system. I think that's phenomenal. In and of itself, it's not going to address the problem. And I'm pretty certain Artur sees this as one of many steps. And I applaud them for their boldness and his boldness in attacking what is an obvious challenge in the industry. But I just want to come back to a comment that you made earlier on, which is, I would hate for us to think it's a zero-sum game. In other words, for the consultancies to win, the agencies must lose, and for the agencies to win, the consultants should lose. We need both. But the difference is, you said we looked at the whole chessboard. You said something like, I thought that The consultants enter the patient through the P&L. They enter the patient through a more integrated view of the business. In the agencies, by definition, because we created it that way, enter through advertising. And I think both, if the consultant thinks that they're going to become agencies overnight, it's going to end badly for them. But they're going to have to understand, and they do, that there is a dramatic integration of content and technology and commercial outcome. And conversely, the agencies need to think the same. And there was a question there about the power struggle between IT and agencies, or IT and marketing. When people think that the size of the space that they're playing in has like a 2-foot diameter, they're reluctant to let someone in there because it gets a little cramped. The reality is the size of the diameter that we're playing in now is like 400 miles wide. We need more people in it, and they need the agencies, and the agencies need them. And I think we got to think more in terms of it's not a zero-sum game. And we will create, by definition, both players, consultants and agencies, and most definitely clients will accrue value from that.
So Peter, you have a future as a systems integrator.
I guess so. I'm very pleased. I'll be calling you tomorrow.
Brandon, were you going to?
I was just going to say, I mean, look, some of the best meetings I've been in are with agencies and clients, and with whiteboarding. Some of the things we forget about is AI and all these things. You still have to have ideas. They still have to be human-led. If we live in a box of data, everyone's going to come out with the same thing. So there has to be an element of that. And not to discredit, but execution is really difficult, right? So strategy is one piece, and you can do that, but executing a campaign across multiple partners, across different messages, different audience, all these different things is really hard to do. And there are some, I've worked with some agencies that have, these guys are turning to be experts across multiple disciplines because they have to be agile and bounce around. And so no longer are the days you have agencies where it's a mobile team and a social team. These guys are jumping all over the place and really working to execute. So I think we got to keep in mind execution and ideas are still important.
You've got to be able to walk and chew gum, as we say.
Yeah.
Guys, I know that we've got our time is finished here. I appreciate you spending these 30 minutes with us. I appreciate your insights, appreciate your attention, and thank you.